What if the school bully picked the wrong girl? Someone with a connection so powerful, it could change everything. This inspiring story follows Amara Ellis, a quiet new student who becomes the target of Chase Dalton, the most feared boy at Riverside High. He thinks she's weak, an easy victim. But what he doesn't know is that Amara holds a secret, one that will turn the tables in the most unexpected way. Stay with us until the end, because what begins with a bully's arrogance will end with his downfall. Like this video if you believe real courage doesn't need to be loud. And don't forget to subscribe for more stories that remind us true strength always shines through. Amara Ellis stepped off the bus, gripping the straps of her backpack as she stared up at the broad stone entrance of Riverside High School in Columbus, Ohio. The crisp autumn air carried the smell of damp leaves and fading summer warmth off the nearby Scioto River. Students moved in clusters, backpacks slung carelessly over their shoulders, their laughter and chatter echoing between the old brick walls. But Amara felt like a shadow among them. She was no stranger to new schools. In fact, this was her fourth transfer in just 3 years. Some kids moved because their parents changed jobs. Amara moved because sometimes starting over was the only way to survive. She kept her head down as she made her way toward the main doors, hoping to disappear into the crowd. A few students turned their heads, curious about the new girl, but she avoided their eyes. Clearview High wasn't special. Riverside High wasn't either. Just another sprawling suburban high school with a decent football team, a glossy cheer squad, and a social order older than most of the textbooks. None of it mattered to her. She had only one goal: stay invisible. Inside, the hallway buzzed with energy. Lockers slammed shut, sneakers squeaked against the waxed floors, and teachers shouted over the din, trying to herd students into classrooms before the first bell. Amara clutched her schedule tightly. She knew this routine: find the locker, map out safe spots, avoid the wrong people. That was when she saw him, Chase Dalton, tall, broad-shouldered, the golden boy of Riverside High. His Letterman jacket hung open, and he leaned against a row of lockers, flanked by a crowd of boys who laughed a little too hard at everything he said. Even from across the hall, Amara could feel it, the magnetic pull of his arrogance, the way people either wanted to be him or feared him. She knew his type. She'd seen boys like him before, boys who thought the world belonged to them. She didn't plan to draw attention, but the world had other plans. As she passed, someone shoulder-checked her hard enough to send her books flying across the hall. It wasn't an accident. A few students turned to watch, some chuckling. Amara knelt down, ignoring the burn in her cheeks as she gathered her things. "Well, well, what do we have here?" The voice was smug, rich with mockery. She didn't have to look up. She already knew it was Chase Dalton. His tone was smooth, almost lazy, but underneath it, Amara could hear the threat. She heard his friends snickering behind him. Slowly, Amara rose, her arms full of scattered notebooks and folders. Chase stood over her, arms crossed, wearing a smirk that dared her to say something. "I don't think I've seen you before," he said. "You knew?" Amara simply brushed past him without a word. But Chase wasn't finished. "Hey," he called after her, voice carrying easily through the hall. "Where's your manners? I asked you a question." Amara kept walking. She had learned long ago that boys like Chase wanted a reaction. The best way to strip them of their power was to give them nothing. But Chase didn't like being ignored. A sharp tug on her backpack pulled her back a step. Not enough to hurt, but enough to let her know he wasn't done. Amara stopped and turned slowly. For a moment, the hallway seemed to hush. Even the kids who hadn't been paying attention now leaned in. She met Chase's gaze steadily. Something flickered there. Curiosity, maybe confusion. He wasn't used to being looked at like that. "You shouldn't have done that," Amara said, her voice low and calm. Chase raised an eyebrow. Then he laughed, slow and mocking. "And why's that?" he sneered. Amara didn't flinch. She just held his gaze, unwavering. Chase tilted his head, his grin growing wider. "You're kinda weird, you know that?" A few snickers rose from his crew. Amara turned back around and kept walking, her steps sure and measured. She didn't have to look back to know that Chase was watching her, plotting his next move. But he had no idea what kind of mistake he was about to make. The rest of the day blurred by. Amara kept to the edges of her classes, answering only when necessary, eyes always scanning for trouble. At lunch, she sat near the windows alone, picking at her sandwich, while Chase and his friends laughed loudly at their usual table, pretending the world hadn't shifted. By the end of the day, the heavy Ohio heat clung to the pavement as Amara made her way to the bus stop. Just as she reached into her backpack for her phone, a voice called out behind her, "Hey, new girl." She turned to see Chase standing there, hands in his pockets, that same lazy grin plastered across his face. Behind him, his crew lingered, buzzing with anticipation. Amara sighed, exhaustion weighing her down. "What do you want?" Chase stepped closer, his smile sharpening. "You got a serious attitude problem." Amara said nothing. "You think you're better than us, huh?" Chase said mockingly. Amara let out a soft laugh, not nervous, not scared, just amused. And that, more than anything, threw Chase off balance. "I think," she said slowly, "you should walk away." Chase's grin faltered. For a moment, he looked almost unsure. "Oh yeah?" he said, stepping closer. "And why's that?" Amara leaned in just slightly, her voice a whisper, meant for only him. "Because you have no idea who I am." Chase chuckled and shook his head. "Yeah? And who exactly are you?" Amara didn't answer. Instead, she pressed a button on her phone. From around the corner, a black Cadillac Escalade roared up to the curb, the deep purr of its engine silencing the crowd gathering at the entrance. The tinted window rolled down, and there he was, Sylvester Stallone. Chase's grin collapsed. His friends shifted nervously, unsure whether to laugh or run. Amara turned back to Chase, her smile easy, unbothered. "Still think I'm just some random girl?" she asked. Chase's Adam's apple bobbed as he swallowed hard, his confidence draining away. Stallone sat behind the wheel, one hand on the steering wheel, eyes locked on Chase. He didn't need to speak. His presence alone filled the space with something heavier than words. Chase muttered something under his breath, like he was trying to convince himself this wasn't happening. Stallone finally spoke, his voice gravelly but calm. "Get in, kid." It wasn't a question. Amara didn't hesitate. She walked past Chase, past the stunned silence of the students who had begun to gather, and slid into the passenger seat. Stallone shifted the Escalade into gear, and the car pulled away from the curb, leaving behind widened eyes, dropped jaws, and the unmistakable sound of Chase Dalton's world beginning to crumble. Neither of them spoke at first. The city blurred past the windows, the golden sun dipping low over Columbus's skyline. Amara tapped her fingers lightly against her jeans, exhaling the tension she had carried all day. Stallone's eyes stayed on the road, his fingers drumming a steady rhythm against the wheel. "You okay?" Amara nodded, Then after a moment, she chuckled softly. That was kind of dramatic, huh? Stallone smirked, the corner of his mouth lifting. Maybe a little. Amara shook her head, looking out the window. I didn't mean for them to find out like that. He glanced over at her. And what would have been better? Letting some punk like that walk all over you? She leaned her head back against the seat, smiling a little. I wasn't going to let him. I was just waiting. Stallone raised an eyebrow. Waiting for what? She shrugged. The right moment. For a moment, Stallone was silent. Then he let out a soft laugh. You sound like me when I was your age. Amara turned, a small smirk tugging at her lips. That's a little scary, you know. He laughed, a real hearty laugh that made her feel lighter. Smart ass. They drove, in comfortable silence, the weight of the day fading into the soft hum of the city. But Amara knew better than to think it was over. Not yet. Chase Dalton wasn't the type to take humiliation lying down. And even if he had tasted fear today, fear had a funny way of curdling into anger. When they pulled into the driveway of their modest, quiet home on the edge of town, Amara unbuckled her seatbelt but didn't move to get out right away. Stallone noticed. Something else on your mind? Amara hesitated, then let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. He's not done with me. Stallone studied her for a long moment, his face thoughtful. No, he said finally, voice steady as stone. But you're not done with him either. Amara met his gaze. You think I should fight back? Stallone leaned back, resting his arm along the top of the steering wheel. I think you need to be ready. Guys like him, they don't like losing. Amara pressed her lips together, thinking. Then she nodded. Yeah, she said quietly. I know. The next morning at Riverside High, Amara walked through the halls, feeling the weight of dozens of glances following her every step. Students pretended not to stare, whispering into their hands as she passed, their eyes wide with the kind of curiosity usually reserved for celebrity sightings. Some faces were amused, others wary, and a few, like those of Chase's crew, were openly hostile. She saw them clustered near the lockers, their voices dropping into tense murmurs when she approached. Chase himself leaned against the lockers, arms crossed, his face tight with something new, uncertainty. He didn't smirk this time. He just watched her, his gaze sharp, calculating. Amara didn't flinch. She met his eyes for half a second longer than necessary before turning and walking to her first period. If Chase wanted to play the long game, she could play it too. Patience was a language she spoke fluently. The day passed with a strange, crackling tension hanging in the air. Everywhere Amara went, she felt it buzzing under her skin. The expectation, the pressure. But she gave them nothing. She answered questions in class, when called upon, calm and composed. She ate lunch alone, like she always did, ignoring the way heads turned toward her table every few minutes. Chase and his friends sat at their usual spot, but the mood was different now. Their laughter was forced, brittle. Chase kept stealing glances at her, his fingers tapping restlessly on the table. It wasn't fear she saw in his eyes. It was something more dangerous, humiliation, and humiliation was fuel for boys like Chase. By the time the last bell rang, Amara was ready. She walked to her locker with steady steps, already bracing herself for what she knew was coming. Sure enough, as she rounded the corner, she found her locker trashed again. Books dumped onto the floor. Marker scribbles layered over the previous insults. Crude drawings etched deep into the metal. She stopped for a moment. letting the sight wash over her. Students gathered nearby, lingering at the edges, pretending to talk while sneaking glances at her reaction. Amara bent down and began picking up her books, stacking them carefully, methodically. She didn't rush. She didn't tremble. She moved like someone assembling something much more important than a few scattered papers. Across the hallway, Chase watched, arms folded tightly across his chest, his expression expectant, almost hungry. He wanted a scene. He wanted her to snap. But Amara refused to give it to him. She closed her locker with a soft click, slung her backpack over her shoulder, and walked away without a word. That night, at home, Amara sat at the kitchen table tapping her fingers against the smooth wood as Sylvester Stallone leaned casually against the counter, watching her. "They trashed my locker again," she said finally, her voice even. Stallone raised an eyebrow. "That's their best move?" She allowed a small smirk. "For now." He nodded, arms crossing over his chest. "So what's yours?" Amara leaned back in her chair, staring at the ceiling for a moment before answering. "I'm going to let him dig his own grave." Stallone chuckled, a low, approving sound. "Now that's my girl." The next morning, the atmosphere at Riverside shifted again. The rumors had evolved overnight, transforming into something bigger, harder to ignore. Everyone knew now who Amara Ellis really was, or at least who her father was. And with that knowledge came fear, but not the kind Chase had anticipated. It wasn't fear of Amara. It was fear of being seen standing on the wrong side when the dust settled. Students who had laughed at her humiliation 2 days ago now offered hesitant nods in the hallway. A few even muttered apologies under their breath. Teachers who had turned a blind eye to the bullying now watched Chase and his crew with wary eyes. At lunch, Amara once again chose her quiet spot near the windows. She unpacked her lunch slowly, feeling the room's pulse around her. Chase sat at his usual table, but it was obvious he was struggling to hold on to the easy confidence he once wielded. His friends whispered behind their hands, their eyes flickering between him and Amara. Tension crackled in the air like an approaching thunderstorm. Then, right on cue, Chase stood up, his tray clattering loudly against the table. The cafeteria fell into a hush as he made his way toward her, swaggering like he had something to prove. Amara didn't look up from her sandwich. She kept eating, slow and deliberate. Chase stopped a few feet away, his voice sharp and loud enough for everyone to hear. "Hey, Ellis," he sneered. "You need your daddy to come fight your battles for you again?" A few nervous chuckles rippled through the cafeteria, but most students stayed silent, waiting. Amara finally looked up, her gaze cool and steady. She set her sandwich down carefully and wiped her hands on a napkin before speaking. "I don't need anyone to fight my battles," she said, her voice calm but carrying easily across the room. Least of all, against someone who's already lost. There was a beat of silence. Then, somewhere near the back of the cafeteria, someone let out a low whistle. A few students snickered. Chase's face flushed a deep, angry red. His hands clenched at his sides, and for a terrifying moment, Amara thought he might actually swing at her right there. But he didn't. He turned sharply on his heel and stormed back to his table, the eyes of the entire cafeteria boring into his back. The tide had turned. Over the next few days, it became clear that Chase's grip on Riverside High was slipping. His friends grew quieter, drifting away in ones and twos. Rumors about his behavior spread faster than he could squash them. Someone had gotten hold of text messages and screenshots, ugly, hateful things he had said about classmates, even teachers. Screenshots that found their way onto group chats, Instagram stories, and eventually the desks of school administrators. By Friday morning, the damage was irreversible. Amara walked through the halls with her head high, no longer invisible, but not isolated either. Students nodded at her, some offering small smiles. Teachers greeted her by name. The locker that had been vandalized was freshly painted, her books neatly stacked inside, untouched. Chase, on the other hand, looked like a ghost. His locker was bare, his usual entourage scattered. And when he passed Amara in the hallway, he didn't smirk. He didn't speak. He just looked away. That afternoon, as Amara packed her bag at the end of the day, she felt a presence behind her. She turned to find Chase standing there, his hands shoved deep into his pockets, his shoulders hunched. For the first time, he didn't look like a threat. He looked like a boy who had finally realized he was no king after all. "You think you're better than me," he said, voice low and rough. Amara regarded him for a long moment. Then she shook her head. "No," she said quietly. "I just didn't waste my time proving it." He flinched as if she'd struck him, then turned and walked away, disappearing into the crowd. That evening, sitting at the kitchen table, across from Stallone, Amara finally let herself breathe. The house smelled like pancakes and syrup, and the low hum of a baseball game played on the TV in the background. Stallone sipped his coffee, watching her with a small, proud smile. "You did good, kid," he said. Amara smiled, feeling lighter than she had in months. "I didn't throw a single punch," she said. He laughed, that deep, familiar rumble. "Sometimes the best victories don't leave bruises." Amara nodded, her heart full, her spirit steady. She had faced down everything Riverside High had thrown at her, and she had won, without ever stooping to their level, without ever losing herself. And that, she realized, was a victory no one could ever take away. Monday morning arrived with a damp chill in the air, a thick blanket of fog rolling over Columbus like a silent tide. Amara stepped off the bus, her backpack slung casually over one shoulder, her head held a little higher than it had been a few weeks ago. The front courtyard of Riverside buzzed differently now, like a room that had been rearranged overnight. Students who once looked through her now acknowledged her presence with nods, some even with small, tentative smiles. It wasn't hero worship, and it wasn't fear. It was respect, the slow, cautious kind that only comes after watching someone stand their ground without lashing out. She didn't bask in it. She didn't need to. The quiet was enough. Inside, the hallways were calmer. The loud, brash energy that Chase and his crew used to inject into the atmosphere had thinned out, replaced by something more subdued, even uncertain. Amara navigated the familiar maze of lockers and classrooms with steady steps, feeling more like she belonged here than she ever had before. She knew there would be another test. There always was. People like Chase didn't disappear quietly. He would make a final move, not because he had a winning hand, but because losing without a fight was something he couldn't stomach. It happened 2 days later. Amara was on her way to the library during her free period, her sneakers whispering against the polished floor, when she saw a small crowd gathered by the gym doors, the kind of gathering that always preceded something messy. She slowed her pace, heart thudding once, hard and heavy, but she didn't change course. As she approached, she saw him, Chase, standing squarely in the middle of the hallway, flanked by two of his remaining loyalists. His posture was tense, rigid, his jaw set in a tight, furious line. As she drew closer, the crowd parted just enough for her to step into the center. She stopped, keeping her expression carefully neutral. Chase sneered, his voice pitched just loud enough for everyone to hear. "You think you're better than all of us, huh? Just because you got a famous daddy to ride in on a white horse?" A few murmurs rippled through the crowd, but most stayed silent, watching, waiting. Amara tilted her head slightly, studying him the way she might study a cornered animal. There was no power in him now, only desperation. "I don't need anyone to fight my battles," she said simply. Her voice didn't shake. It didn't rise. It carried. Least of all against someone who's already beaten himself. Chase's face flushed, an ugly red crawling up his neck. He took a step forward, chest puffed out, like he was preparing for a confrontation that had already ended. One of his friends muttered something under his breath, but Chase didn't hear him. He was too busy drowning. "You think you're so smart," Chase spat, "but you're nothing without his name, without his money." Amara smiled, not cruelly, but with a patience that seemed to drain the venom from his words. "You're wrong," she said, "because no matter who my father is, I know who I am. Can you say the same?" The hallway was so quiet, she could hear the faint buzz of the fluorescent lights overhead. Chase opened his mouth to respond, but no words came out. His hands balled into fists at his sides. Trembling with rage, he no longer knew how to aim. Amara stood there, calm, unbothered, an immovable force in a battle he no longer had the strength to fight. Finally, Chase shoved past her, shoulder-checking her hard enough to make her stumble, but she caught herself easily, regaining her balance without missing a beat. The crowd let him pass, parting wordlessly as he stormed away, leaving behind only the sharp, metallic taste of defeat. Afterward, the whispers grew again, but they were different this time. Not rumors, not gossip, stories. Stories about the girl who faced down the biggest bully in school without ever lifting a hand. Stories about how strength didn't always come from the loudest voice, but sometimes from the one that refused to be silenced. Teachers smiled a little wider at her. Students she barely knew stopped her in the halls to offer quiet nods or simple greetings. Riverside had changed, and so had she. That Friday afternoon, Amara sat on the porch steps of their small house, a book resting open on her lap, the late autumn sun warming her shoulders. Stallone pulled into the driveway, the familiar rumble of the Escalade making her look up. He got out, a grocery bag in one hand, and sauntered over with that easy gait that never seemed to hurry, but always got there just in time. He dropped down onto the steps beside her, with a quiet grunt, setting the bag down with a thud. For a few minutes, neither of them spoke. They just sat there, breathing in the crisp air, the world moving slow and forgiving around them. "You did good," Stallone said eventually, his voice low and certain. Amara didn't answer right away. She traced a finger along the edge of her book, thinking. "I didn't win because of you," she said finally, her voice soft but sure. "I won because I remembered who I was." Stallone smiled, pride flickering in his eyes, like a match struck against stone. "That's the whole trick, kid," he said. "Most people spend their whole lives forgetting." They sat there until the sun dipped low behind the trees, casting long golden shadows across the lawn. The street lights flickered on one by one, and somewhere down the block, A dog barked lazily at nothing in particular. Amara closed her book and leaned back on her elbows, feeling, for the first time in a long time, like she wasn't just surviving. She was living. At Riverside, Chase Dalton's legacy crumbled into dust. By winter break, his name was a cautionary tale, not a badge of honor. Colleges that once lined up to recruit him quietly withdrew their offers. His parents tried to sweep it under the rug, but the truth had already taken root. And the truth, once planted, didn't die easily. Amara didn't gloat. She didn't need to. Her victory wasn't in his downfall. It was in the fact that she had never lost herself in the fight. She had stayed true. She had stayed steady. And in doing so, she had changed not just her own story, but the story of Riverside High. It was a quiet revolution. But sometimes the quiet ones are the ones you should fear the most.